wind howled outside like some wild, invisible creature gnashing its teeth at the walls. Snowflakes danced through the air, each one sharp and cold, like 1,000 tiny knives cutting into the skin. The small cabin stood alone in the middle of the forest, miles away from any town or city. The flickering light from the fireplace was the only source of warmth as it cast eerie shadows on the walls. Inside, everything seemed peaceful, but the storm outside was a growing threat. Emma sat curled up in front of the fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her thoughts as dark and quiet as the night around her. She had come here for peace, away from the city, hoping that time in this remote place would help her recover from a difficult year. But tonight, something felt off. Something about the quiet was wrong. She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind. There had been no one around for miles, no cars, no animals. The silence of the place was suffocating, but Emma had learned to deal with it over the last few days. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty room. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity. The wind outside seemed to be picking up, howling louder and louder with each passing minute. It was almost as if the world outside had been swallowed by an endless coldness. But then, a noise broke the silence. A soft scraping sound, barely audible, like something gently dragging across the floor. Emma froze, her body going stiff as she tried to make sense of the noise. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked around, half expecting to see a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, but nothing was there. The fire crackled and popped in the fireplace, but nothing else stirred. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "It's just the wind." The scraping sound came again, but this time it was louder and closer. Emma's eyes darted to the doorway. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw a shadow move across the edge of the room. She hadn't heard anyone approach the cabin. No one could have gotten this close without her noticing. Could it be an animal? Her thoughts raced as she slowly reached for the small iron poker next to the fireplace. She crept toward the door, her body tense and her senses heightened. The storm outside raged, filling her ears with its deafening roar, but still, the odd scraping sound continued, steadily growing nearer. The handle of the door rattled, and Emma nearly jumped out of her skin. She gripped the poker tighter, but her legs were frozen in place. Then, the door creaked open on its own. Cold air rushed into the room, chilling Emma to the bone. She forced herself to step forward, though every nerve in her body screamed for her to run. When she stepped into the small hallway that connected to the front door, she looked down toward the stairs leading to the attic. The sound of soft scratching came from above her, and her stomach turned as she forced herself to look upward. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. For a long moment, there was no answer, no sound except for the wind and the growing noises from above. Then, from the shadows of the attic came a slow, deliberate thump. The thump above her was slow, heavy, like something or someone was making their way across the attic floor. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as she stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her grip on the iron poker tight enough to cut into her palm. What was that noise? No one else was supposed to be here. She had made sure the cabin was completely sealed off, no windows left open, and no door unlocked. The thought of an intruder made her stomach twist, but at the same time, she could not ignore the strange dread slowly creeping over her like an invisible fog. Another thump, louder this time, echoed from the attic. It was followed by a faint scraping sound again, like nails slowly dragging against wood. Emma took a step back, pressing herself against the wall. Her mind raced, frantically searching for any logical explanation for the noise, but every possibility seemed worse than the last. Okay, it's just an animal. Just an animal that got inside somehow, she muttered to herself, though she could hardly believe her own words. The storm outside was fierce. Animals rarely wandered out during such weather. Yet, there was something else. The sounds weren't natural. Animals didn't drag themselves across floors or drag nails against wood. The air in the room grew cold, colder than before, the chill seeping into her bones. There was no denying it anymore. Something wasn't right. She glanced toward the stairs again. A shadow moved above her. No more thumps this time, just the soft shuffle of something unseen dragging itself closer toward the edge of the attic. In an instant, a wave of terror swept over Emma. She had no idea why, but instinctively, she knew she could not stay downstairs. She turned and ran back toward the living room, her feet pounding against the old wooden floor. But as she turned the corner, something made her stop dead in her tracks. A figure. At first, it was just a flash, something from the corner of her eye, but as she looked harder, her breath caught. There by the window, the outline of a tall shape seemed to be watching her, though she couldn't quite make out any details. The storm outside seemed to swirl in on itself, the wind now a muffled growl, as if the world had closed in around her. The shadow by the window was motionless, standing like a ghost waiting to strike. Emma couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Then it moved. The figure stepped toward her, its long limbs distorted and strange. Emma tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The shadow stretched unnaturally, jerking like it was caught in a twisted nightmare. For an instant, the figure seemed to shift, to twist into shapes that should not have been human. Frozen in fear, Emma watched as the figure crossed the room to the door to the attic. The door opened on its own with a slow, creaking sound. As the figure stepped toward the stairs, it didn't seem to touch the ground with its feet. It glided, an unsettling float that sent a rush of icy dread through Emma's entire body. Something deep within Emma told her that running was no longer an option. She had already seen too much. Her heart hammered against her chest, and as she looked at the open door leading to the attic, she understood. It wasn't an animal up there. It was something far worse. The sound of breathing filled the space. It was so cold, so unnatural. The breath wasn't from a human or animal. It was dry, ragged, and full of rage. Slowly, Emma backed away, inching toward the door, trying not to make any noise. Every step felt as if it could be her last. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the old lantern hanging on the wall, fumbling with the switch. With one flick, the dim glow filled the room, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The figure had reached the foot of the stairs now, lingering in the light. The room grew even colder, and Emma's breath formed thick clouds in front of her face. She couldn't pull her gaze away from the figure that moved, nearly floating toward the steps. Its eyes, a pair of glowing embers, bored into her. Its body contorted as if breaking in all the wrong places, but it moved with purpose. As the figure climbed the stairs toward the attic, Emma's knees nearly gave way beneath her. Panic flooded her senses, but her feet wouldn't let her move. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat. For a moment, there was only the eerie silence of the storm, but then, upstairs, came the unmistakable sound of something dragging. And it wasn't just a sound. It was the unmistakable feeling of a presence in the attic, of something having come back, something waiting for her. The strange shadow now hovered at the attic door. It wasn't quite in the light, just beyond its reach, moving behind the edges. And then, without warning, it vanished. Emma's breath came raggedly, and she slowly dared to step toward the stairs, though every muscle in her body screamed for her to run. If she turned around now, she'd be able to bolt out of the door, back into the blizzard, into the dark night. But something made her pause, an odd pull that came from above. It was as if the attic itself was beckoning her. Emma stood at the foot of the stairs, her breath shallow and rapid. She was torn between two impossible choices: run as fast as she could out into the cold, leaving behind the terrible presence in the cabin, or face whatever haunted the attic, whatever the shadow had wanted her to see. The idea of escaping through the door into the storm chilled her more than anything in the house. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the terror of facing whatever waited for her in that attic. Yet, the silence above, the eerie stillness that had now replaced the noise of shuffling, was just as terrifying. It was like the cabin itself was holding its breath, as if the very walls were watching her. Another scraping sound broke the stillness. The noise was distinct this time, louder, like something sharp was being dragged across wood. Her gaze shifted towards the attic door once more, but the figure was gone. In the silence that followed, she felt an undeniable urge to step up to the attic. Something was waiting for her up there, and it wouldn't let her go unless she found out what. "Get a grip, Emma," she whispered to herself, forcing herself to take one shaky step after another up the stairs. The wood creaked beneath her as she ascended, the pitch of the storm growing louder outside. The wind slashed against the windows, but inside, there was only the sound of her breathing and the slow, deliberate scrape coming from above. As her hand grasped the old attic door handle, she hesitated. It was cool to the touch, yet strangely comforting, a stark contrast to the overwhelming cold she felt inside. She could almost sense the unknown breathing on the other side, pushing her closer and closer to opening that door. Without warning, it swung open, as though it were eagerly waiting for her to cross that threshold. The air in the attic was thick and musty, almost suffocating. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow from the lantern she'd carried up with her. Dust particles floated lazily through the stagnant air, and the floor creaked underneath her. But it wasn't just the age of the house, it was the feeling of something older, something much more ancient that clung to the walls. The room was nearly empty, save for a few old wooden crates and a strange pile of shredded fabric that seemed to pile up near the far corner. Emma's eyes fell on it, but it was the torn fabric that pulled her attention in deeper. It looked oddly familiar, almost as though it belonged to a jacket she'd seen somewhere before. She took a hesitant step toward it, the sound of her breath echoing loudly in the silence. Her body protested, telling her to stop, to get out of there and leave before it was too late. But her curiosity overpowered the warnings. As she reached the pile of fabric, she brushed her hand through it. Beneath the fabric, her fingers met something much colder than the surrounding air. A bone. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly jerked her hand back, instinctively stumbling away from the pile. But the terrible sight did not end there. When she looked down again, she could see what lay beneath the remains of the torn clothing. More bones, parts of a body that had been left to rot in this very attic. The skeletal remains were sprawled out in an unnatural way, contorted, as if someone had been twisted in agony. There was no way this had been there before. Was it fresh? Had someone put these remains here recently? She felt the ground begin to tremble beneath her, as if the very house itself was shifting with a terrible, unnatural force. And then she heard it, the softest of whispers, so faint that Emma barely recognized it. At first, she thought it was the wind, but this wasn't the howling wind from outside. This voice seemed to breathe against her ear, cold and ancient. "You shouldn't have come." Emma froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and fear held her still as the shadows around her seemed to deepen. Something moved behind her, in the corner of the room. She knew it wasn't the wind. She knew it wasn't just a trick of the light. Something, or someone, was there, watching her every move. "Get out, before it finds you." The voice, weak and raspy, sent shivers down Emma's spine. Who are you?" Emma managed to gasp, her voice trembling with fear. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were drawing in around her. The only reply was a low, rumbling growl that echoed off the walls. It was the sound of something too large, too ancient to be human. Something that had been waiting for years, hiding beneath the fabric of this forsaken house. Without warning, Emma turned and ran out of the attic, her heart racing with a terror she couldn't comprehend. She tried to avoid looking back, knowing that looking behind her would make whatever hunted her that much closer. But before she could even step onto the stairs, she felt something cold graze her neck. The pressure of unseen fingers. The scratching sound resumed, but this time, it was louder, sharper, closer than ever. Emma stumbled, losing her footing as her foot caught the edge of a step. She cried out, but there was no time to recover. She pushed herself forward, gripping the railing, scrambling for the safety of the floor below. The shadows in the attic were coming for her. Down the stairs she rushed, but something chased her, not footsteps, but a cold whisper, as if the very house itself had come alive. "It's too late. You're ours now." With her heart pounding in her chest, Emma threw herself toward the door. reaching the entrance only to realize, too late, that it was locked. She pulled desperately at the doorknob, panic seizing her, her hands shaking. As she struggled to open the door, she saw the shadows spill out from the base of the stairs, slithering, moving, creeping toward her, covering the floor like a tide of darkness. The air grew unbearable. She gasped for breath, only to find that the coldness was now inside her lungs. Something in the corner of the room shifted, and then everything went dark. When Emma awoke, it was as though she had been pulled from the very depths of a nightmare. Her head ached, her vision blurred, and for a moment she wasn't sure where she was. She sat up quickly, panic rushing over her like a tidal wave. The chilling weight in her chest told her that something was wrong, terribly wrong. The storm still raged outside, its winds howling and roaring as the cabin creaked in protest against the fury of nature. But inside, there was an eerie stillness, as if the house itself had ceased to breathe. Emma's breath was ragged, and she wrapped her arms around her body, trying to steady herself. She blinked several times, trying to shake off the disorienting fog clouding her mind. The light of the lantern, which had been faintly glowing before, was now completely gone. The room around her was dark, unbelievably dark. Even the occasional flash of lightning outside didn't pierce the thick gloom that suffocated the space. Suddenly, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, ragged, and far too close. Her heart skipped a beat, and she slowly turned her head toward the source of the sound. There, just beyond the periphery of her vision, was a silhouette. Not a person, no. It was something. Worse. Tall and twisted, its shape contorting unnaturally in the darkness, the edges of its body fading into the blackness like an oil spill. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed a bright, sickly red, watching her with an intelligence that chilled her to the core. The creature remained motionless, silent for a moment, before a grotesque scraping sound echoed through the room, its claws dragging slowly over the floor as it inched forward. The reality of it hit Emma like a punch to the stomach. She had to move. She had to escape. But her body refused to obey. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature. Its twisted form seemed to be drawing her in with its dark presence, its hollow, gnawing stare. It spoke then, but the voice was not words. It was a deep, vibrating growl that reverberated inside her skull, pressing against her mind like an unbearable weight. "You cannot leave. You are here now." The voice was everywhere, it seemed, inside her head, pushing deeper and deeper. Emma stumbled back, gasping for air, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle again, only to find that it wouldn't budge. Something was wrong with the door, as though it had been sealed from the outside, or maybe the house itself had trapped her, held her in this room where the shadows could reach her. It has begun, and it will not end until it is done. A shadow passed across the room, and in a flash of blinding white light from the storm outside, Emma caught a glimpse of it. The creature was closer now, much closer, its face impossibly large, a black void stretched between its glowing eyes. It smiled, an impossibly wide grin full of jagged, broken teeth. Without thinking, Emma reached out with shaking hands, desperate to pull open the door, but the dark whisper returned, closer this time, echoing through her body and mind, rattling her bone. It's too late. You cannot leave us." In the midst of the nightmare, her survival instincts kicked in. She gripped the lantern that sat nearby, the metal cold and slick with fear, and with all her might, she swung it at the door, hitting the knob with a force that shattered the glass. She didn't hesitate, pushing her way through the splintered wood, ignoring the cuts on her hands. There was no time. The room went dead silent for a brief moment. Then the shadows behind her lunged. She was propelled forward into the dark hallway, but there was no time to think, no time to wonder if she had truly escaped. She could hear the sound of the thing, it, still scratching and scraping behind her. There were no footsteps, no slow, deliberate movements anymore. It was chasing her now, fast and furious. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she slammed her way down the hall and towards the front door of the cabin, her arms shaking from exertion. She turned the handle, but it didn't open. Panic flooded her. She rattled the door again and again, praying for it to give way. "Please, please just let me out," she screamed inwardly. She grabbed the edge of the door and shoved her shoulder into it, as if sheer force might make it budge. The door finally gave way with a splintering crack, and Emma burst outside, staggering into the harsh wind. Like a slap across the face, but she didn't stop. Her feet pounded against the snow-covered ground, her heart pounding louder than the storm itself. But as she ran, the storm grew worse. The snow whipped her face, making it nearly impossible to see. The wind pulled at her clothes, slowing her down. There were shadows darting in and out of her peripheral vision, and the panic in her chest grew stronger, making it harder to breathe. Then she heard it. The scraping, louder than ever before. She turned, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the fog of snow and darkness, but nothing was there. The only sound was the wind's howl and the crunch of her boots in the snow, but that sound, that relentless scraping, it seemed to come from inside her mind now. The growls, the whispers, "You will not escape us, we are everywhere." The cold was biting. Her legs ached, her vision blurred from the relentless storm, but she had to keep going, keep running. Somehow, she had to escape, had to survive. The mountains in the distance blurred through the thick snow. She couldn't hear anything now, nothing except the sounds of her footsteps in the deep snow, and yet, the unease never faded. She had to make it. She didn't know where or how far she had to run, but there was something she knew for sure. Whatever had haunted the cabin, it was still out there, watching, waiting, and no matter how fast she ran, it would never let her escape. Emma's feet sank into the snow with every step, and the cold bit deeper, sinking through her jacket and into her very bones. She kept running, barely able to keep her footing in the harsh winds that pushed against her with each violent gust. The dark forest around her was a maze, the dense trees hiding everything and offering no refuge. It was as if the very world was closing in on her, surrounding her with the cold, the wind, and the hunger. She tried to look over her shoulder, but the storm blinded her, and the swirling snow made it impossible to see far in any direction. Still, she felt it. It wasn't just a presence anymore, it was something worse. Something that grew nearer with every frozen breath she drew. Whatever was hunting her, no, whatever had never left her since that night in the cabin, was circling close. The shadows from the attic, the whispering voice in her mind, were now trailing her through the storm like a relentless predator. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her breath ragged and sharp, but Emma forced herself to keep moving. The crackling scrape echoed around her now, like broken branches scratching at the night. But it wasn't the trees. It was something else. It was getting closer. She glanced to her left, heart thudding wildly. Was something moving in the trees? The outlines of figures seemed to shift in the wind, blurry, indistinct, but she knew better than to look back for too long. It was there, following her. No, it was not following. It was hunting. She dared to glance back once more. The figure, the same horrifying shadow she had seen before, emerged from behind the gnarled trees, moving effortlessly through the blinding snow like it was no more than a part of the storm. Its form stretched out impossibly tall, like it was dissolving into the very night itself, an amorphous shape that defied logic and movement. Its eyes were now blazing, glistening like fiery embers set into black, jagged rock, and the scraping sound grew louder with every passing step, gnawing at her sanity. "You cannot outrun us." It spoke, not with words, but with that same guttural growl that shook Emma from the inside out. The snow seemed to freeze in midair as the voice slammed into her head, overwhelming her, making it harder and harder to breathe. The creature wasn't just in her mind now. It was in every breath, every step, every creak of the snow beneath her boots. Emma's vision blurred with terror. How much longer could she keep running? She felt that same dread again, that paralyzing certainty that no matter what she did, no matter how fast or far she went, this thing would always find her, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Every instinct in her body screamed to escape, but her legs were starting to give way. her mind unraveling with each scraping step. How could she escape it? In front of her loomed a sudden hill, steep and high, its peak just barely visible in the distance. She couldn't know for sure, but she had the desperate thought that it might lead to a place of safety, away from the creature's reach. It might be her only hope. No one escapes, no one leaves. The whisper came again, more distinct than ever, almost as if the creature were standing right beside her. Emma could feel its burning eyes fixated on her, tracking her every movement, every breath. Still, with no choice left, she pushed herself toward the hill, the storm swirling harder around her. As she climbed the hill, every step felt like an eternity. Her legs burned with each movement, the cold so overwhelming she felt as if she might fall to her knees and never stand again. The snow came in blinding, biting swirls that stung her face and made it impossible to keep her eyes open for long. Her mind began to cloud, fatigue making it harder to see where the summit might. Every single part of her screamed for her to stop, to rest, but Emma couldn't. With one final burst of willpower, she reached the top of the hill. It felt like an eternity had passed. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, but looking down over the other side. She couldn't believe what she saw. It wasn't a road. It wasn't a shelter or anything resembling safety. No. As her eyes focused, she realized where she had gone. The cabin. But ordinary view. From her vantage point at the top of the hill, Emma could see the entire structure, but it wasn't the same as when she had first arrived. The cabin was different. The windows were no longer just dark. They seemed alive, glowing faintly from within. And now she saw the twisted, unnatural shapes at the window, watching her. She wasn't safe at all. She had circled right back. There was a horrible, sickening realization in that moment. The place that she thought she had escaped, the nightmare that had tormented her, was still there. It never left. This was its true form, its way of luring her back in, keeping her in its grip. The darkness had found a way to pull her back, no matter how far she ran. "You always come back." The voice was louder now, even more commanding. She knew deep within her heart that the creature, the shadow, the thing from the attic, was waiting for her to return, and it would never let her escape. Not unless it was done. As Emma stood frozen at the top of the hill, her body beginning to tremble from cold and fear, she saw the shadow moving toward her, no longer hidden by the trees. It moved through the blizzard with unnatural grace, its form elongated, distorted by the very wind itself. A cruel, malevolent shape. It reached out toward her. Emma gasped, taking a single step back, her heart in her throat. And in that brief second, she realized the full truth of what had happened. She hadn't been running from the creature. It was pulling her, always pulling her back into the fold. There was no escape. Emma could feel it closing in. The shadow, the creature, whatever dark force had claimed this place. The wind whipped around her like an icy scream, its violent gusts trying to pull her down the hill toward the waiting darkness. Her breath quickened as fear surged within her, but her body had stopped obeying. She was too tired to keep running. For a long, frozen moment, she stood there at the summit, her heart beating in time with the relentless screeching wind. The towering, featureless form of the creature neared, its shape slowly coming into sharper focus. Its hollow, burning eyes seemed to bore into her very soul, and despite everything inside her telling her to fight, to run, Emma knew deep down that it was too late. She was already caught. She was already lost. "You belong to us now." The voice sounded in her mind again, not an echo but a reality that filled the air itself. Emma's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her face burying itself in the snow. The cold bit at her skin, but even it felt far away, muted by the horror growing inside her chest. She had thought she could escape. She had tried to leave this cabin behind, tried to outrun what had followed her, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere in this storm, in this endless night. "The house is ours. You are ours." Her mind began to fracture, images blurring together. The creature's outline became even more twisted, its body long, dark, and somehow alive with the night's cold, seeping into the air, becoming part of the storm itself. The darkness around her thickened until it suffocated her, and her lungs felt tight with each attempt to breathe. Through the suffocating fog of terror, one thought kept repeating in her head. The thing had lied to her. It told her there was no escape, that she couldn't leave, but that wasn't true. She had never truly left. The wind howled louder, the last shred of her will slowly fading into the abyss, until, finally, she surrendered. No fight, no resistance, just the silent acceptance of what was happening, what had been happening the entire time. The ground felt cold, unforgiving beneath her body, and the terrible warmth of the creature's presence was now fully upon her, a heavy and oppressive weight. Emma didn't need to look up anymore. The darkness was consuming her from within, but now, it no longer mattered. The thing spoke once more, its breath on her skin ice cold and suffocating. "Welcome home, Emma." And in the swirling white abyss, the darkness closed in, erasing her. Everything ceased. The snow, the wind, the storms. The terrifying pull of something malevolent no longer needed to chase her. She was already claimed. The cabin, the creature, the shadow of that place would never let go. Forever trapped in that cold, isolated night. Forever pulled into the grasp of the thing from the attic. Forever part of its twisted hunger. And just like that, Emma disappeared. Her name no longer mattered. She had become part of the shadows, her memory lost to the relentless, unforgiving winter. Lost to a place where the sun would never touch, where no light could ever penetrate, and where the horror of what she had once escaped would forever pull new souls into the darkness. The winds outside howled, colder now than before, but inside, there was silence. The storm continued, as it always had, and the cabin stood dark and quiet on the edge of that forsaken hill, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to come, its icy breath carrying a chilling whine that seemed to echo from the mountains above. Below, the small village of Elder's Hollow lay in darkness, nestled in the heart of the mountains. Snow had been falling for hours, the kind of snow that doesn't stop, the kind that makes the night feel like it's being swallowed whole. Inside one of the village's oldest cottages, Amelia stood by the window, gazing out into the endless night. Her breath fogged up the glass, but she didn't step away. The darkness outside seemed to be watching her. She wasn't imagining it. There were shadows moving beneath the trees, as if something or someone was waiting. But it wasn't just the strange movement in the forest that made her uneasy. There was a silence in the air, a feeling that something unnatural lurked just beyond her line of sight. For as long as she'd lived in the hollow, this felt different. The villagers often spoke of strange events, things they didn't understand. The elders would whisper about old superstitions, warnings of curses that had been in the land since before anyone's memory. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, a quick, firm rap that nearly made her jump out of her skin. Who could that be? Amelia whispered to herself. She wasn't expecting visitors, not with the storm raging outside. Her instincts told her not to answer, but she couldn't resist the pull. She opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand on the lock, just in case. Standing outside was a tall figure, shrouded in a heavy coat of dark fur, their face hidden beneath the hood. A pair of eyes gleamed eerily from the shadows beneath the hood. Amelia couldn't make out their expression, but she sensed they were watching her with intent. "Evening, miss," the figure said in a low, gravelly voice. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I've lost my way in the storm. Would you be kind enough to let me in for a while?" Amelia hesitated. She was alone in the house, far from the village center. She knew the people in Elder's Hollow, and no one seemed to fit the figure at her door. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "I'm just a traveler," the stranger replied. "I've been caught by this storm, and I need a place to stay until morning. Please, I mean no harm." His words should have reassured her, but something in the way he spoke made her question his sincerity. Yet the storm raged on behind him, and there seemed to be no one else in sight. Amelia's logical side told her to let him in. The storm was unforgiving, and no one deserved to be left out in the freezing cold. but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. "All right, just for tonight," she said, finally stepping aside to allow him in. The figure walked past her, brushing a snow-covered boot against the wooden floor, as if he was perfectly familiar with the cold surroundings. His scent was strange, a mixture of pine and earth, sharp and pungent. He pulled back his hood, revealing a pale, gaunt face with sharp, hollow cheeks. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling thing of all, like dark pools that seemed to go on forever. "I didn't expect anyone in this village tonight," Amelia murmured, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I prefer it that way," he responded softly, settling by the fire. "Too many people create too much noise. Out here, you can hear the silence. Listen long enough, and you'll hear the world speaking its own language." Amelia stayed in the doorway, unsure whether to step closer or leave him to his quiet thoughts. The crackling of the fire filled the room, but her eyes never left the stranger. Something in the way he settled into the chair near the hearth struck her as unnatural, too calm, too still, as if he was no longer entirely human. "How long have you been traveling?" she asked, desperate for some kind of normal conversation. "A long time," the stranger replied vaguely, almost cryptically. "Sometimes time stops moving when you stop looking at it." There was an odd coldness in his voice that sent a shiver running down her spine. "I can offer you some food, if you're hungry," she said, though her voice was barely more than a whisper now. Something about the man's presence made her feel exposed, as if her words hung in the air before they had the chance to settle. "No," the stranger said. His voice softened, as though he was savoring the moment. "I'm already fed, but I wouldn't mind some warmth. It's bitter out there." Amelia made her way to the stove, trying to focus on any task that might calm her nerves. But despite the warmth of the fire, her skin crawled with an inexplicable sense of dread. There was something about his stillness that felt too deliberate, like a predator lying in wait. The storm raged outside, but now it sounded more like a distant whisper, like the trees were sighing with quiet, impatient breaths. "Do you live here, alone?" the stranger asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence as his gaze followed Amelia with that unsettling, undivided attention. "I live alone, yes," she replied. She wasn't sure why she told him the truth, but it felt almost necessary. "Is there something you want?" His dark eyes flicked to the small table in the corner of the room where a candle burned. A flash of something, interest, amusement, or perhaps hunger passed through them. "I want nothing, except to stay here until the storm passes." He stood up, and despite the softness of his tone, the change in his posture felt like a warning. "But I wouldn't recommend leaving the door open for too long." Amelia froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her gaze darted toward the door, which she had indeed left ajar when she'd let him in. But when she turned back, the stranger's piercing eyes never left her face. "What do you mean by that?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can hear it too, can't you?" The stranger continued, stepping toward her slowly. "The night, the voices, the things that are waiting just outside." Suddenly, it wasn't just the storm that caused the cold in her bones. It was the palpable weight of something unseen, a presence gathering in the darkness outside. It was a night unlike any other. The wind howled through the trees with a force that seemed more like a scream than a gust. Far off in the distance, the tiny village nestled at the foot of the snowy hills remained untouched by the terror that would soon unfold. The street lamps flickered and cast an eerie glow across the icy streets, but even the lights seemed too afraid to linger in the cold. Sarah had never been one to believe in ghost stories or the supernatural, but tonight, as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, something deep in her gut told her that this winter's night would be different. Something old was awake, something dark, something that had been forgotten by the village for centuries, and it was coming for her. As Sarah walked through the village, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck, she tried to push away the uneasy feeling growing inside her. The snow crunched under her boots as she moved, the silence around her louder than the sound of the wind itself. The usual warmth of the village at night, families gathered in their homes, the smell of baked goods or fresh firewood, was gone. The only sounds she heard were her own footsteps and, curiously, something else. A faint whisper. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe a stray dog howling from somewhere deep in the woods. But it was too clear, too persistent. "Help me." The voice was soft, barely a murmur, but unmistakable. Sarah stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see someone in the distance. A lost traveler, maybe. Or a fellow villager coming from the inn. But the street was empty, save for the swirling snowflakes. Again the whisper, "Help me." This time, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was coming from up ahead, near the old church at the far end of town. The one that hadn't been used in years. As children, Sarah and the others had dared each other to run up and touch the doors, but no one had ever entered. It was a place of legends, whispered stories of something dark that haunted the ground long after the last priest had left. Most people in the village avoided it now. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Maybe it was just the cold making her senses dull, or the stress from a long day. She couldn't be sure, but something told her that whatever was out there, near the church, wasn't a figment of her imagination. Without fully thinking, Sarah turned and walked toward it. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, the wind carrying the whispers to her ears. "Help me." As she drew closer to the church, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The light from the street lamps disappeared, swallowed by the impenetrable darkness that surrounded the towering stone structure. The front doors were wide open, an unnatural invitation into the cold. The whispers grew louder. They sounded frantic now, desperate. The feeling of dread washed over her like an icy... Please, help me. Frozen in place, Sarah stared at the open doors. She knew she should turn around and go back home, but the voice, was it human? And who or what was crying out for help at this time of night? There was only one way to find out. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the churchyard. The snow felt thick underfoot, as though it had built up for centuries, rather than just the night. The building itself seemed to loom over her, its broken windows glowing with an unholy light. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold. Inside, the air was still and cold, almost suffocating. The wooden pews were rotted with age, dust drifting through the air like forgotten secrets. But in the center of the room, something was moving. A shadow, a shape, a silhouette. And then, a voice. "Please, you have to help me, it's not what it seems." Sarah's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just pleading, it was familiar, but she couldn't place where she had heard it before. Who are you?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. From the shadows, something stepped forward. A figure, hunched over, its face hidden by a cloak of darkness. The smell of decay wafted into Sarah's nose, and she wanted to run. Her instincts screamed at her to get out, to leave before it was too late. But before she could turn and escape, the figure reached out and grabbed her arm. Her pulse raced as the cold, bony fingers dug into her skin. There was no time to scream, only time to fight. "You don't understand," it rasped. "They've been waiting, and now they're coming for you."